Good morning, good morning, good morning. It's a tender Tuesday, the 25th of February, and you've joined us on the Fifth Connection, where we are excited again to walk through the unfolding story about the book that is written to Christian Hebrews, that they no longer remain Hebrews, but that they hold on to their confession. The book is about stick-to-itiveness and staying with what God has in Christ, to hold on, to keep on holding on. There is a beautiful, beautiful story which became a movie many years ago, and as a 10, 11-year-old, I had the privilege of watching this movie. It came out in 1968. And it was called The Shoes of the Fisherman. And even though it was a little beyond my grasp from an intellectual perspective, I remember the story well because it was about a Roman Catholic priest. His name was Kirill Lakota, and of course he was played by Anthony Quinn, very famous film star. And after spending many, many years in a Siberian gulag, a labor camp, he's set free by a Russian leader played by Sir Laurence Olivier. And this happened at the height of the Cold War, when the Russians and the Chinese were locked in an intense battle. And so following the death of the Pope, Lakota ends up on the global stage when he is chosen to be the Pope's successor. Of course, there are many twists and turns in the story because he least expects that he would be the one. And as the Pope, the humble Lakota becomes a very, very avid and compassionate advocate for ending world hunger and poverty. And he proves to be what one in that position ought to be. When we look at our unfolding story in the book of Hebrews, we see that we have a foundation for stick-to-itiveness. We have a base to move from. And that basis is the superordinate Son in verse 1 of chapter 1 to verse number 4. He's the superordinate one. He's the Son of God, but he's just no Son of God. He's a special one. He's the one above all other. And he's described later on only in the text as Jesus. And as the writer unfolds the story from verse 5 to chapter 10, verse 18, he talks about the superordinate one is the superordinate way because of his worth and work. And then from verse 19 onwards of chapter 10 to chapter 13 is the superordinate walk. We are in chapter 7 this morning, and we're going to look at 3 verses that unfold the story of this exhortation. It is brief, according to Hebrews chapter 13, verse 22. The writer says, I wrote to you briefly. Well, it takes him 303 lines or verses to unfold the story. And to read it as an unfolding story is important. We're so bent on book, chapter, and verse, and we think life works like that. So when problems come up, it's book, chapter, and verse. Verses, the context is the context of an unfolding story. And these Christian Hebrews, their lives would tangentially touch this meta-narrative, this meta-story that unites believers. Of course, their encouragement is press on. Don't drift in chapter 2. Don't dull your senses in chapter 3. And then in chapter 5, in chapter 5, don't dull your senses. And the challenge in the second warning is Basically, the challenge to believe, only believe. Don't fall into unbelief. Don't disbelieve. And then in chapter 5, chapter 10, and chapter 12, the rest of the warnings and encouragements come up. So when we look at chapter 7, he's going to introduce us again to this cryptic king. And this is the fourth block on Melchizedek. I've done 3 other blocks. You will need to follow those episodes. There's a ton of information on Melchizedek. And yet, as soon as he appears in Genesis 14, this king disappears. A cryptic king. And so I've tracked the Old Testament evidence and storyline of Melchizedek across the Old Testament, right into the Second Temple period, where you see Jews struggling with who Melchizedek is, and they connect the dots, but in a sense, they over-connect the dots, because some comments are made about Melchizedek that the Old Testament doesn't make. For example, verse 1. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. Now, who is he? Well, verse 1, Melchizedek is introduced, and so is verse 10. For he is still in the loins of his ancestor, that's Levi, Abram's ancestor, when Melchizedek met him. And so you have a sandwich structure here. In verse 1, you have slice 1. Verse 10, you have slice 2. And from verse 2 to verse 9, you have the delicacy, introducing us to this great character again. It's not the first time he's mentioned in Hebrews, but I cannot track through all of that info again. We've got 3 other episodes where we cover this information. But Melchizedek is described as the king of Salem, the priest of the Most High God. Please remember, he rocks up on the scene out of a Canaanite context. When Abe comes into the land, it is Canaanite in its flavor, in its culture, in its language, and everything else. And lo and behold, here's a king of Salem. Now, this is no anachronism. He's the king of Salem. He's the king of peace. He is a priest of the Most High God, which shows his superiority to Abram. Why? Because he blesses Abram. Now, that is very interesting. The writer of Hebrews introduces his readers to this king. And this king received a tenth from Abraham, and blessed him as his superior. Melchizedek is the superior, thereby showing that he was a superior priest, greater than the Levitical priesthood, which came from Abram. Now, Melchizedek is similar to Christ in a number of ways. It's not that Christ is similar to him, as you see across these 3 verses. It's the other way around. Melchizedek met Abraham. And Hebrews 7 from verse 1 to verse 10 explains the comparison between the 2 characters. And there's a reason for why the writer of this story says that the Christian Hebrews were dull. They could not understand certain things. And that's why he had to suspend his discussion concerning Melchizedek. And he goes, what we would say, he takes a bit of a rabbit trail, and then he comes back to Melchizedek. Because while you're still babes and you needed to be teachers, but now I still need to feed you milk rather than solid food, because solid food belongs to those whose senses have been trained. So there's a comparison of Christ to Melchizedek because Melchizedek's attributes are the same as Jesus. Jesus is the Son of God. Melchizedek is the King of righteousness and the King of peace and the blesser of Abram in verse 1 and 2. And then secondly, his claim on the office of high priest is not hereditary in verse 3. Melchizedek's claim on the office of high priest is not based on heredity. And you're going to see why in a moment. And then thirdly, Christ does what Melchizedek did. He blesses Abram in verse 4 to verse 10, which we'll look at in the next episode. And so you see that this tithe that is paid to this king priest, it says in verse 2 that Abram gave 1/10 of his spoils from war to Melchizedek, whose name means King of Righteousness, and whose title, the King of Salem, means King of Peace. For he is without a genealogical tie in Genesis. In other words, he has no genealogy. What the writer is showing is that the issue of no lineage is what is the comparative element to Jesus. Right? Jesus being the Son of God. So he is like the Son of God, this king priest, Melchizedek, for he is without genealogy, without father, without mother. Now, some go off on this, and you have a couple of positions. You have one position that says, oh no, Melchizedek is a divine figure. He's God. Well, the fact that the text says he's without father and mother, and that he's therefore of divine generation, has other problems to it. Now, this is one position. He's the heavenly father. A second position says he's an illegitimate human. In other words, he was one born out of wedlock because he doesn't have a father. He's without a father or mother, without genealogy, right? Because that's what disqualified a male from becoming a Levitical priest, according to Numbers 3 and verse 10. So that's another perspective. But we can unravel this because all the writer is doing is pointing to a priestly qualification. Not that Melchizedek was a supernatural being, but his priesthood did not depend on a specific genealogy the way the Aaronic priesthood depended on it, right? It was brought in, right? And you can read all about that across the Old Testament. So the only priesthood that's available is the one from the tribe of Levi. And if you take that stuff away, then God calls him a priest according to Psalm 110. And then, of course, in Genesis 14. And so Melchizedek is described as one without a genealogical qualification. No mom or dad. And he is the one who qualifies because he's independent of the lineage that gave rise to priests. And the one that God began, the line that God began, and God never terminated the priesthood of the order of Melchizedek. And Jesus follows in that line. He follows the order of Melchizedek because Melchizedek is the one who mirrors Jesus in the Old Testament from a priestly perspective, a priesthood forever, without father, without mother, because Jesus would be a high priest forever. And so very close study reveals that this king priest is the one after whom Jesus' priesthood is modeled. And so we need to bear in mind that many have tried to suggest and identify who who Melchizedek is. And some have even suggested Shem. Listen to it. Shem. The Talmud is made up of the Mishnah and the Gemara. They are all, the Mishnah would be the oral law, and the Gemara would be pontifications by rabbis in discussion with students about these oral laws. These are great traditions within Judaism. So you have two Talmudic traditions. The one is the Babylonian Talmud, and the other one is the Pseudo-Jonathan Talmud. And it's in the Talmuds that there's this identifier that this righteous king is Shem, the son of Noah. Now, that is a post-biblical filter that many scholars use, because the Talmuds are post-Old Testament. They come after the Old Testament, anywhere from the 1st to the 9th century AD. And so these are not inspired texts. They are discussions on the inspired text of the Old Testament. So that's where that idea comes in. But from verse 1 to verse 3, you have Abram paying tithes to Melchizedek, showing Melchizedek as superior to Abram. Right? And Jesus follows suit, because Jesus is the one who follows after the order of the Melchizedekan priesthood. So this is deep stuff. And it takes deep study, careful reading to extract this kind of information. So tomorrow we're going to continue in verse 4 to verse 10. But my question to you this morning is, what is your posture when you engage in inexplicable, unnerving realities? Abram encounters a Canaanite king, one of Canaanite extraction, and he knows who this king is. How he knows, we don't know. Did God reveal it to him by a voice from him? We don't know. But watch Abram's posture. He engages in a posture that shows that he's walking with God. And when things are inexplicable, he just goes with what God is revealing. How does your posture show when you hit these tough, inexplicable, unnerving kinds of realities? This king rocks out of nowhere in Genesis 14, and Abram's posture is such that he knows who this king is, and he pays homage to this king. And so tomorrow you're going to see further how Abram's submissive posture shows. You are going to encounter things today in your life where your posture needs to show. Is your posture going to be one of submission, or is it going to be one of fighting? One where you take God on, as it were. You're not submissive to him and to the challenges he presents. You'll have opportunities to do that today. So I want to thank you for listening. Join us tomorrow, same time, same place, for the next exciting episode. May God bless you and have a good day.